Hello, my name is Laura Irvin. Police brutality and violence. African Americans, the target of authority figures. This sounds like a news article from last year, but it's not. So, what can we learn from history? The compelling story I found is used to explain to local county historical societies from the historical newspaper archives involves Columbus, Georgia during the 1970s. So racial tensions in Columbus, Georgia in 1971, they peaked. 8 African Americans had been dismissed or were suspended from their position as a police officer. One officer was reinstated, but 7 other officers, they weren't reinstated. So they were dismissed for ripping the American flag shoulder patch from their uniform as a protest of discrimination within the department. So the hearing board upheld the suspension of the officers. The hearing board was comprised of both African Americans and white citizens from Columbus, Georgia. So the African Americans, the citizens, they were angry at the findings and in which they had been treated, in the ways in which the police officers had been treated by their superiors. So African American police officers, they weren't only not able to arrest white citizens, but they also could only patrol in Black neighborhoods. So this literally lit a spark that caused a string of fire bombings in Columbus, Georgia. The anger erupted with vandalism and fire bombs. The fire bombings were attacks on white storefronts, and the firemen, they were able to quickly extinguish these fires. But these attacks followed a protest of over 500 African Americans that had happened earlier in the day. In an effort to kind of fight the violence, Mayor J.R. Allen, he would call in the state patrol. So why would he call in the state patrol? Well, an African American had been shot by a white detective. Willie J. Osborne Jr., he was shot in the back when he was running from the officers when they were trying to question him about in regards to a robbery of only $241. So the African American officer, they protested this. And they protested shootings like this and claimed that the police department targeted their Black community. And authorities stated his death was not related to the racial strife, but patrols were doubled and they believed that a new curfew would be enforced. They were threatened with this if violence increased. There were pickets and lawsuits over the discriminatory practices by the police department. And Columbus, during the day, looked like it was life as usual. There was no disruptions from sunup to sundown. But when the sun went down, those businessmen were on edge. Store owners slept at their businesses with rifles or shotguns by their sides, and there was over 150 cases of arson. There was a similar number of false alarms that produced attention, and that was palpable. So the African Americans marched and they met to discuss the unwritten rules of segregation that was happening in Columbus, Georgia. So the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition had Hosea Williams come down, and he urged nonviolent methods to achieve their goals. It was noted in the news article that when Williams arrived in Columbus, that's when the fire bombings began. In an effort to curb the violence in Columbus, the leaders issued a ban on the sale of liquor and firearms, and they accompanied this with a contingent of state troopers. So slowly the violence would begin to fade, and the ban was lifted, and the troopers returned home. But one demonstration brought back the troopers and reinvigorated the violence. And when the police interacted with local protesters, and they would start swinging riot batons. And not only would they swing these riot batons, but they would also injure 6 and arrest 5. This was met with more fires and shots being fired at officers. Columbus was at a crossroads. What would they do? So then Governor Jimmy Carter would come, and he proclaimed that Williams from the SCLC was there only to increase the violence and the tension, and it was for publicity. So Williams replied that Carter was a racist. Tensions continued throughout the summer, with the SCLC being blamed for the increase in violence and disruptions. But October 5th, 1971, 3 men would be arrested for the fire bombings. 2 men were the dismissed police officers, William T. Crawford and Jesse James Warren. And that was along with another man who was not a dismissed police officer, Daniel Webster Anderson. The 3 blamed each other, and they all thought the other person was 80% responsible for the arsons. Then one other man, William L. Malone, would also be arrested for the bombings. The woman he lived with, she told him that he must move out. Her husband was returning, and he refused, so the woman turned him in. And that ended the fire bombings in Columbus. I hope you enjoyed this.